It all began with a sky that refused to behave. The evening light spread not in streaks of gold, but in drifting shapes, clouds curling like paper, torn slowly, folding into the outline of whispers. A boy lay beneath them, his small hands resting behind his head, watching as if the sky had written something only he was meant to read. He didn't know why the world seemed to hum for him, or why the hush of wind carried tones like a lullaby, but he felt it in his bones. Others called it silence. He called it listening. The house where he grew up was ordinary in ways that felt comforting. Wooden stairs creaked in the same places, the kettle whistled every night, and the clock ticked its patient rhythm on the wall. Yet within that ordinary space he lived with a strange certainty that he was part of something softer, something unseen. His sister often teased him for staring too long at nothing, though she admitted later, when she was lonely, that the quietness he carried made her feel safe. There were nights when she cried in the small room across the hallway, muffling her sobs into a pillow. He never said much. Words often felt too sharp for fragile moments. Instead, he would reach, longer than his arms should stretch, farther than the space should allow, brushing her hair with a touch that shouldn't have been possible. She never asked how he managed, and he never explained. She only whispered, almost to sleep, that she was glad he was there. The boy thought of it less as a gift and more as a way of existing. To reach was not about grasping, but about being present. When he carried books for his mother, when he pulled a fallen apple from under the fence, when he lifted the blanket his sister had kicked to the floor, he thought of it as natural as breathing. Still, he knew the world around him did not quite see it the same. They noticed little things, how objects seemed to come back into his hands too easily, how he never had to move as much as others to retrieve what he wanted. But no one pressed him. Perhaps they feared naming it would break its spell. Time seemed to hold him gently in those days, as if the hours wanted to linger so he could remain in that strangeness a little longer. He often wondered if the clouds whispered only to him because he listened, or if everyone else had forgotten how. The thought stayed with him each night as he drifted toward sleep, his sister breathing softly across the hallway, the clock steady on the wall, and the wind outside carrying those drifting songs of sky. And somewhere in that quiet rhythm, something began to bloom, though he could not yet name it. The stretch of his arms was only the beginning. What mattered more was the stretch of his heart, quietly learning how to hold the fragile moments of others without breaking them. The world was still small, but in that smallness, wonder had already begun to grow. The years passed quietly, but the strangeness never left him. What began as simple touches across the hallway grew into moments that startled even himself. He could reach for a book high on a shelf without standing, or pluck a drifting leaf from the air when it seemed impossibly far. At first, he thought it was only a trick of his body, a secret meant to be hidden. But secrets, when held too tightly, begin to whisper louder. His sister, growing taller, began to notice more. One morning, while they sat at the wooden table, eating bread that their mother had baked, she caught him lifting a cup that was well beyond his reach. She didn't gasp, she didn't shout. Instead, she tilted her head and said softly, almost with a smile, "You don't always move like the rest of us." He froze, unsure of what to answer, until she added, "But that's fine. It makes you different in a good way." Then she returned to her bread as if the matter was settled. That simple acceptance shaped him more than he realized. It allowed the strangeness to feel less like a burden and more like a quiet thread woven into his life. With it, he became gentler, more careful. He began to notice not just objects within reach, but feelings lingering in the people around him. When his sister struggled with her lessons, he stretched, not with his arms, but with patience, sitting with her for hours until the words on the page felt less frightening. When his mother sighed at the end of long days, he learned to take small burdens from her hands before she asked. The town they lived in was small enough that everyone knew one another, yet he often felt as though he stood on the edge of something only he could see. The fields carried their own whispers, the rivers hummed beneath their surfaces, and the night sky seemed to bend a little closer whenever he watched too long. None of it frightened him. It was simply the way the world breathed, and he was lucky enough to notice. One evening, as he walked back from the village square with his sister, the clouds shifted again into those strange drifting shapes he had loved since childhood. She paused, staring at them for the first time the way he always had. "Do you hear it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not the way you do. But I think I can feel it when I'm with you." Her words stayed with him, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. It was then he began to understand that his gift was not meant to separate him from others, but to bring them closer. The stretch of his arms was nothing compared to the reach of his presence. The more he accepted it, the more the world seemed to open. Yet beneath this quiet unfolding, a question lingered in the edges of his mind. If the sky had chosen him to listen, then what, someday, would it ask him to do? The question of what the sky wanted lingered like a quiet echo, never loud enough to disturb him, but steady enough to follow him into every day. As he grew older, he noticed how the whispers of the world seemed to weave into his ordinary moments. The marketplace was full of voices, but beneath them he could sense something softer, like a current moving through the noise. When an old man struggled to lift a basket, he felt it before he saw it, his hands already reaching to help. When a child dropped a toy into the stream, his arms stretched farther than the water should allow, bringing it back as if the stream itself had placed it in his palm. People often looked at him strangely, but they never questioned too deeply. Small kindnesses rarely invite suspicion. His sister, though, saw more than anyone else. She began to watch him the way he once watched the sky, her eyes following not just what he did, but how he seemed to listen to things no one else could hear. She grew quieter about it, never teasing anymore, never asking questions, only choosing to be beside him in silence. Their bond became less about words and more about presence. He didn't always understand her moods, her sudden bursts of laughter, or the way she would fall into stillness, but he understood her heart. That was enough. At night, the whispers of clouds returned, shaping themselves into drifting figures that resembled stories half remembered. He lay awake, wondering if they were trying to show him something, a path, perhaps, or a reminder that the reach of his hands was not meant to end in simple acts of kindness. He wondered if the gift that had always been part of him was in some way a message still unfinished. It was during one of those evenings that he met the librarian. The man appeared almost suddenly in his life, as though he had stepped from the very pages of the drifting clouds. He was not young nor frail, but carried himself with a gentleness that seemed carved from time. His voice was soft but steady, and when he spoke, it was as if he had already listened to the silence long before choosing his words. He noticed the boy's quietness at once, the way he lingered at the shelves as if waiting for the books to choose him instead of the other way around. The librarian leaned down with a smile that carried no surprise, only recognition. "You listen differently," he said, his eyes warm, not curious but knowing. The boy felt his chest tighten, unsure if it was fear or relief. For the first time, someone had put words to the strangeness he carried. The librarian did not demand an explanation, nor did he offer one. Instead, he placed a book in the boy's hands, its pages worn, its cover faint with age. "Take this," he whispered. Some things are meant to be read slowly the way one listens to wind. That night, as he read by the small lamp in his room, the boy felt the words drift into him the way clouds had always done. They were not just stories, but echoes of something older, something waiting. The whispers of the world, the stretch of his arms, the comfort of his sister's quiet presence. Suddenly they felt like parts of the same thread. He didn't yet know what they would weave, but the thought of it filled him not with fear, but with a calm, steady wonder. The world was opening, gently, and he was learning how to follow. The book the librarian had given him was unlike anything he had read before. Its pages were filled not with grand adventures or loud histories, but with small, almost invisible details, quiet reflections on rivers, the rhythm of walking through fields, the way light folded at dusk. He read slowly as the librarian had advised, and each line seemed to stretch into him, not demanding thought, but asking for patience. The words hummed in the same way the clouds had always whispered, as if they belonged to the same language spoken in different forms. He returned to the library often after that, and the librarian welcomed him without question. They rarely spoke of the strange reach of his hands, though the boy sensed the old man noticed. Instead, their conversations circled around gentler matters, the comfort of repeated routines, the wisdom of silence, the importance of seeing what others overlook. "Most people chase the loud moments," the librarian once said, as they shelved books together, "but the quiet ones shape who we are. If you can hold them, you'll never be empty." The boy carried those words carefully, the way one carries a fragile flame through the wind. At home, life unfolded with the same steady rhythm. His sister grew more curious about the world beyond their small town, her eyes often lingering on the road that led outward. She didn't say much, but he noticed how she leaned against the window, fingers tracing absent shapes in the glass. Sometimes he wondered if she too felt the pull of something larger, though hers seemed directed outward, while his always circled back, inward. Still they remained close, each balancing the other in unspoken ways. There was one evening, heavy with the scent of approaching rain, when the boy found her crying again. Not the frightened sobs of childhood, but tears softer, almost tired, as if she carried something too large for her age. He reached for her, and his arms stretched across the room in that quiet, impossible way, brushing her shoulder until she leaned into him. "You don't have to explain," he whispered. "I'll hold it with you." She didn't answer, but her breathing steadied, and that was enough. He realized then that his gift was not about what he could do, but about what others could feel when he did it. Presence turned into comfort, and comfort into trust. The librarian noticed the boy's growing calmness, the way he began to carry himself with a steadier step. One late afternoon, as the sky darkened with clouds, he led the boy to the farthest corner of the library, where shelves leaned with age and dust floated like drifting stars. From a small drawer, he pulled another book, older than the first, its spine cracked, its cover nearly faded to nothing. He placed it gently into the boy's hands. "This one isn't for reading quickly." "Either," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But when you're ready, you'll understand why it came to you." The boy pressed the book to his chest as he walked home, the rain beginning to fall in slow drops around him. The streets were empty, The world hushed except for the soft tapping of water on rooftops. He felt the same familiar hum rising in the air, the same whispering presence that had followed him since childhood. Only now it seemed to echo through the book in his hands, as though the sky and the pages had conspired together to remind him of something he had yet to discover. That night, with the lamp casting its faint glow, he opened the book carefully. The words swirled differently this time, more elusive, like fragments of a dream half remembered. They didn't tell a story so much as they stirred one awake inside him. As his eyes grew heavy, he felt not just that he was reading the book, but that the book was quietly reading him in return, learning the shape of his thoughts, the stretch of his heart. He let sleep take him slowly, the whispers of rain blending with the quiet voices of the page, both promising that what lay ahead would unfold gently in its own time. The next few weeks passed like a gentle stream, carrying him through quiet changes that only later would he understand as part of something much larger. The book the librarian had given him became his companion, not just in the library but in the quiet moments of his life. He carried it with him everywhere, its pages worn and soft from being opened over and over again. Each time he returned to it, it felt as though the words were shifting, like they were waiting for him to return to them in a different way. It wasn't the kind of book that told him answers, but one that guided him to ask better questions. His sister, noticing the way his eyes grew distant sometimes, began to talk to him more. She spoke of the things that were changing in her life, the friends she had made, the dreams she had begun to weave from the conversations they had in town. There was an ease in her voice now, a quiet confidence that had not been there before. She was becoming someone else, someone apart from the boy who had once listened to the softest winds. But that didn't seem to trouble him. He understood it, in a way. People grew in different directions, but somehow they always came back to the same place. One evening, after a long day spent reading in the library, he stood at the edge of the town, watching the sunset unfold in soft strokes of orange and purple. There was a stillness that settled around him, like the world was waiting for something. The wind carried a whisper he knew too well, and for the first time he didn't just hear it, he understood it. The sky, the trees, the earth beneath him. They were all speaking to him in a language he had learned to recognize over time, each word a fragment of something greater. It was then that the librarian's voice came back to him, soft and steady. If you can hold them, you'll never be empty. He felt the truth of it in his chest, like something warm stirring to life. He had spent so much time listening, reaching, and offering comfort. But there was something else, something he hadn't been able to name until now. There was a gift in holding the silence, in letting the quiet moments settle like dust around you. He didn't realize it until that night, standing by the edge of the town, but the stretch of his arms had never been just about reaching for the things around him. It had been about holding the things that couldn't always be seen. The silent conversations with his sister, the comfort he offered his mother in small, unnoticed gestures, the quiet understanding between him and the librarian. All of them were threads weaving together in a larger design. The gift wasn't in what he could touch or move, but in the presence he offered, the quiet steadiness that held everything together. When he returned home that evening, his sister was sitting by the window again, her eyes turned toward the road. He sat beside her, not needing to speak at first. They both watched the sky, now darkening with the approach of night, as stars began to flicker into place. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a wordless promise that they would continue to grow, to change, but always with a quiet foundation beneath them. He reached out, not with his hands, but with the soft presence that had always been his to offer. And she leaned against him, her breath steady. He didn't know what the future would ask of him, what the sky or the earth or the librarian would require. But he knew, in that moment, that he was ready. Not because he could stretch farther than anyone, but because he could hold what was already there, gently, without rush, without demand. And perhaps that was the quietest and the greatest power of all. The days drifted, folding into one another like the turning pages of a quiet book. His world, small and steady, seemed to stretch outward, though he wasn't sure exactly what it was reaching for. There were moments, brief ones, where he felt the pulse of something larger in the air, like a sudden gust of wind or the distant sound of a bird calling from the treetops, but it was always just out of reach. Yet he could feel it, a presence at the edge of his thoughts, pulling at him softly, like the whisper of a dream he couldn't quite remember. His sister, still growing in her own way, spent more time with her friends in the town, her laughter now a familiar sound that filled the spaces around their home. She didn't ask questions about the book or the strange way he reached for things. She simply accepted him as he was, a quiet constant in her life, and that was enough. Yet he could see the way she began to change, the way her eyes would occasionally look beyond the horizon, searching for something he didn't understand. He didn't worry about it, though. Sometimes people just needed to find their own path, even if it led them away for a while. One afternoon, as he wandered through the small forest near the town, he saw an old man standing by a stream, his hands resting on a weathered walking stick. The man didn't seem out of place, but he also didn't quite belong. His clothes were faded, and his eyes, though bright, seemed heavy with years. The boy had never seen him before, but the moment their eyes met, the man nodded in recognition. "You've been listening?" the man said, his voice low and steady. The world speaks to those who listen well enough, but few are patient enough to understand it. The boy said nothing at first, unsure of what to make of the stranger. I don't know what I'm supposed to understand," he finally said. The old man smiled softly as though he had been waiting for that exact answer. "You don't need to understand it all. But you will, in time. The sky whispers, the earth hums, and you are part of it all. But you have to choose when to listen and when to hold still." There was a moment of silence, as if the forest itself had paused to listen. The boy felt the truth of the man's words settle in his chest, warm and familiar. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like this, but now it felt different, closer somehow. The reach of his hands, the comfort he offered, the stillness he carried, all of it was connected, like threads in a tapestry he hadn't yet fully seen. Before he could speak, the old man turned and began walking slowly away, his footsteps quiet in the soft earth. The boy stood there for a long moment, watching him fade into the trees, unsure whether the meeting had been real or just a fleeting vision. But when he reached out for the air where the old man had stood, the faintest trace of something like warmth, remained in the breeze. That evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, the boy found himself standing on the porch, watching the same stars he had watched as a child. They twinkled quietly, like a secret only the night could keep. The world felt, for a moment, both vast and small. He had always thought of himself as a part of it, but now he understood that the world was also a part of him. The quiet stretch of his arms, the soft comfort he offered, the way he listened, all of it was a way of belonging, not to a place, but to something much older, much deeper. His sister came out to join him, her presence as steady as ever. She didn't speak, but sat beside him, and they both looked up, letting the silence between them grow comfortable. It was enough to be there, together, under the same sky. For the first time, the boy didn't feel like he was reaching for something beyond his grasp. He simply let himself be, grounded by the presence of the stars and the gentle hum of the world around him. There would be other moments, other questions, but for now, he was content. He had learned, in a quiet way, that some answers came only with time, and others simply didn't need to be asked. The whispers of the world were patient, waiting for him to listen. And in time, when he was ready, they would speak again. The days continued to fold into themselves, each one quietly richer than the last. His connection to the world around him deepened in ways he didn't fully understand, but he felt it in the quiet steadiness of his movements, in the way his presence seemed to fill the spaces between people without them ever noticing. It wasn't about stretching his arms farther or reaching for something distant anymore. It was about understanding what it meant to be fully present, right where he was. His sister began to speak less about her dreams of leaving, though he still saw the glimmer of something yearning in her eyes whenever she looked at the horizon. He never asked her to stay, nor did he urge her to go. He simply held her in the same quiet way, offering the comfort of his stillness, trusting that in time she would find her own way. Sometimes when they sat together, their fingers brushing lightly as they passed a shared cup, it felt as though they both carried unspoken words between them, words that neither of them needed to say. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower into the sky, casting long shadows over the land, the boy returned to the library. The librarian was there, as always, though today there was something different about him, a certain intensity in his gaze, as if he was preparing to say something long held inside. "You've grown," the librarian said, his voice soft but firm. "You've learned to listen, to hold the quiet in your hands. But there's something more waiting for you now." The boy, for a moment, felt the weight of those words like a soft pressure against his chest. "What do you mean?" The librarian smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, as though he were seeing something the boy had yet to fully grasp. "You're ready to hear it. The story that's always been with you, the one that only the quiet ones can understand." The boy felt a shift in the air, a subtle change, like the world had tilted just slightly. It wasn't a new sensation, but it was deeper now, more familiar. There was a whisper in the space between them, an ancient pull, like something inside him had stirred and now waited to be unlocked. Without another word, the librarian gestured to a corner of the room where the light flickered softer than before. There, tucked into the shadows, was another book. This one was different from the others. Its cover was dark, almost as if it had absorbed all the light around it, and it seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. The boy stepped forward, drawn to it like he had been drawn to the other books, but this one felt different. The pages, when he opened them, were not filled with words as much as with patterns, shapes that seemed to shift the longer he stared. His fingers hovered over them, feeling the faint warmth they gave off as though they were alive with something. "This is the one," the librarian said quietly, his voice almost a whisper now. "The story you've been carrying, the one that's part of you, is in this book. But not all stories can be understood in one lifetime. Some you have to live through before you can see the meaning." The boy's hands trembled slightly as he turned the first page, but the moment he did, a soft warmth spread through him, like stepping into the sun after a long, cold day. The patterns on the page began to shift, aligning in a way that made him feel both rooted and lifted, as if he were connected to something ancient, something that had always been. The library around him faded, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed distant. He wasn't sure if he was reading the book or if the book was reading him, pulling him into a place where time didn't matter. All he could feel was the quiet pulse of something larger than himself, something that had always been waiting just beyond the edges of his knowing. When he finally closed the book, hours seemed to have passed, though the sky outside was still holding on to the last moments of twilight. He looked at the librarian, who stood watching him with a knowing smile. "You'll return to this story when you're ready," the librarian said softly. "But for now, you've taken the first step." The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. He felt the weight of what he had just discovered settling inside him, as though the book had planted something deep in his heart, something he would only fully understand when the time was right. As he left the library that evening, the world felt different, not in a way that startled him, but in a way that wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The quiet hum of the world was still there, but now it seemed to carry a rhythm of its own, like the steady beat of a heart he had just begun to recognize as his own. He walked home slowly, his steps steady, not rushing toward anything, not waiting for anything, just letting himself be in the flow of the moment. When he reached his house, his sister was there, sitting by the window, her face turned toward the light of the setting sun. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, and he knew, without needing to say it, that she would find her own path, just as he was finding his, and that, in the quiet way they shared, they would always be part of one another's stories. The world seemed to slow in the days that followed. The air felt thicker somehow, as if it were waiting for something to shift. The boy found himself walking with a quiet steadiness, as though he could feel the subtle hum of the earth beneath his feet, the rhythm of his steps echoing softly in his chest. He carried the book with him everywhere now, though he only ever opened it when he was alone. Each page seemed to draw him deeper, the patterns shifting in ways that felt both foreign and familiar, as though the book was telling him stories he had lived before but had forgotten. He spent more time in the library, drawn by the sense that there was more to learn, more to uncover. Though the librarian never spoke of the book again, it wasn't necessary. The boy understood. Some things had to unfold in their own time, just as the quiet hum of the world had always unfolded around him. He had learned to listen, not just to the words on the pages, but to the spaces between them. His sister's absence grew more noticeable. She had begun leaving earlier in the day, her movements faster now, as if she had somewhere else to be, somewhere outside their small town that called to her more insistently. The boy didn't ask her where she was going, nor did she offer an explanation. They spoke less, but it was not the silence of distance. It was the silence of knowing that both were changing, moving toward something they could not yet name. One evening, after a particularly long day spent reading in the library, the boy decided to take a walk through the woods. The trees were heavy with the quiet weight of dusk, their branches stretching toward the sky like silent witnesses to the passage of time. The world around him seemed to hum, soft and steady, and he felt the pull of something in the distance, something waiting for him just beyond the trees. As he wandered deeper into the woods, he came across a clearing he had never seen before. It was bathed in soft moonlight, the ground covered in moss and wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. There, standing in the center of the clearing, was the old man he had met weeks before, the one with the walking stick, whose eyes had carried the weight of so many untold stories. The boy stopped, not sure if he had truly seen the man or if his mind had conjured him from the shadows. But the man smiled, a knowing, quiet smile, and nodded toward the space around them. "You've come further than you realize," the old man said, his voice as soft as the wind. The boy didn't speak, only stepped forward, his heart beating faster now, as if something within him had stirred. The old man gestured to the moonlit clearing, the soft glow that seemed to pulse with life. This place, it's always been here, waiting for you. But you had to learn to listen first. To let go of the noise that filled your mind. To understand that the answers don't always come all at once. Sometimes they come in pieces, in quiet moments, and you have to let them settle. The boy looked around, feeling the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He had known in some distant part of himself that this was coming. The stretch of his arms, the quiet understanding, the bond he shared with his sister. It was all part of something larger, something he had only just begun to see. The old man's smile widened as though he could see the boy's understanding unfold in real time. You'll find your way just as you always have. But remember, there's no rush. Some things unfold in their own time, and others are meant to stay hidden until you're ready to see them. The boy nodded, not fully understanding the man's words, but feeling the truth in them nonetheless. It wasn't about finding something that was lost, it was about realizing what had always been there, just waiting for him to notice. As the old man began to turn, the boy reached out without thinking, his hand stretching just a little farther than he had intended. But the old man didn't flinch. Instead, he turned back, his eyes meeting the boy's with a quiet understanding. "You've been listening," the man said softly. "And that's all you need for now." The boy watched as the old man disappeared into the woods, his form blending with the shadows, until he was nothing more than a memory. When the boy returned home that evening, the sky was streaked with the colors of dawn, the first light creeping slowly over the horizon. He walked to the window and stood there for a long while, feeling the weight of everything he had learned settle inside him. The book, the whispers of the sky, the quiet understanding he had shared with his sister, all of it was a part of him now, and all of it was leading him somewhere. And though he didn't know exactly where that was, he understood one thing. It would be enough to keep listening. To let the world speak, to let the answers come in their own time, and to trust that when the moment was right, he would be ready. The days blurred together like the gentle sweep of wind through the grass. Time felt both endless and fragile, slipping by unnoticed, yet filled with a quiet anticipation. The boy no longer needed to search for answers. They had already begun to find him in the slow moments when he wasn't expecting them. He had learned that the world would reveal its secrets in time, in the quiet spaces between actions, in the way the light shifted at dawn or the rustle of leaves in the evening. His sister's absence grew more pronounced. She came home less often, her eyes distant, her thoughts somewhere else. He could see it in the way her fingers no longer lingered on the edges of the table, in the quiet tension that seemed to stretch between them whenever they were in the same room. The quiet bond they had shared was becoming strained, as if they were both standing at the edge of something they couldn't yet understand. She was drifting, and he knew that, like the rest of the world, she needed to find her own way. Still, there were moments when she returned to the old patterns, the small, unspoken exchanges, the quiet presence she brought into the room. One evening, when the sun was sinking low, casting the sky in a soft golden light, she sat beside him without a word. There was something in the way she looked at him, a softness in her gaze, as if she were seeing him for the first time in a long while. "You're different now," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. The boy didn't answer at first. He wasn't sure how to. She had always seen him, but now there was something new in the way she looked at him. Something deeper, like she could feel the pull of something larger than them both. He wanted to reach out, to offer her the same quiet understanding he had always given, but he sensed that it was no longer enough. "I think you've always known it," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now it's like you're ready to see it. Whatever it is." The boy's heart tightened, and for a brief moment he wished he could say more. But words weren't needed, not between them. They sat there for a while, side by side, watching the sky change from gold to violet, the stars beginning to flicker softly above them. He realized in that moment that the journey they were both on didn't have to be the same. They could walk side by side, even if their paths diverged, because they had learned, in their quiet ways, how to listen to the world in their own way. As the days passed, he began to sense something else stirring within him, something that was no longer just about listening to the world around him, but about understanding the deeper threads that connected it all. The book had been a guide, but the real lesson was in the quiet spaces between the pages. It wasn't just about reaching for something distant. It was about understanding the connection to everything already around him. One afternoon, while walking through the woods, he found himself at the edge of the same clearing where he had first met the old man. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and the soft rustle of leaves seemed to carry an unspoken invitation. There in the center of the clearing was the same faint pulse of energy, like a heartbeat hidden in the wind. He stepped forward, feeling drawn to it in a way that felt both familiar and new. As he stood there, he closed his eyes, letting the world around him settle into quiet stillness. He could hear the subtle hum of the earth beneath him, the whispers of the trees, the soft rustle of the grass. And then, in the silence, he felt it, the same presence he had always sensed but never fully understood. It wasn't an answer, not yet, but it was a question, one that had always been waiting for him to ask. "What is it I'm supposed to see?" The words came softly, almost like a breath, and for a moment, nothing changed. The world around him remained quiet, still, as if waiting for the answer. Then slowly, the wind shifted, and he felt a pull toward the trees, as though they were calling to him. He took a step forward, then another, the ground beneath him soft and steady. With each step, the pull grew stronger, and he felt himself drawn deeper into the woods, deeper into something that felt both like an ending and a beginning. The path before him seemed to open up, revealing a clearing he hadn't seen before. The trees were taller here, their branches twisted together like an ancient tapestry, their roots tangled deep in the earth. In the center of the clearing was a stone, large and worn by time, its surface covered in moss and vines. It was an ordinary stone, yet it held a quiet weight to it, as though it had witnessed something long ago and had waited for him to come and see. He approached the stone, his fingers brushing lightly over its surface, feeling the coolness of the stone against his skin. It was as if, in that moment, he was touching something far older than himself, something that had always been there, waiting for him to arrive. And then, as if the world itself were holding its breath, the answer came, not in words, but in the quiet stillness of the moment. The journey he had been on, his quiet listening, his reaching, his connection to the world, had been leading him here, to this place, this moment. It wasn't about finding something outside of himself. It was about understanding that everything he had ever needed had already been within him, waiting to be discovered. He stood there for a long while, letting the stillness fill him, letting the quiet wisdom of the stone seep into his bones. And when he finally turned to leave, he felt lighter, as if the weight of the world had shifted just enough to make space for something new to grow. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he felt ready. Ready to move forward, ready to listen, and ready to find the answers that were waiting just beyond the horizon. The quiet stillness of the clearing stayed with him as he walked back through the woods, the pull of the stone still lingering in the air. He had expected something grand, something unmistakable, a revelation that would sweep him off his feet and carry him toward a new understanding. But instead, what he felt was gentler, more elusive. It was a recognition, not of something new, but of something he had always known, buried deep inside him. The world had been waiting for him to listen, and now he had finally begun to hear. As he emerged from the woods and made his way back to town, he felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if the air around him had thickened, charged with a subtle energy. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. The streets were quiet, the usual hum of voices absent, as if the town itself had fallen into a brief pause. It was as though everything around him was awaiting his next move, watching him with the kind of quiet anticipation he had felt in the clearing. When he arrived home, he found his sister sitting by the window again, her gaze distant, her face bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. She didn't turn when he entered, but he could sense the change in her just as he had sensed it in himself. There was something in the way she held herself now, an unspoken awareness that hovered between them like a soft, unbroken thread. Without a word, he sat beside her. They both stared out at the horizon, the fading light casting long shadows over the land. The silence between them was not heavy, but it carried a quiet understanding that neither of them needed to voice. It was as though they were both waiting for something, for some unseen moment that would change everything, yet neither of them knew exactly what that moment would be. After a long while, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "I think I'm ready to go." The boy didn't turn to look at her, though he could feel the weight of her words settle between them. He had known this was coming, had sensed it in the way she moved, in the way she no longer seemed to belong to the small world they had shared. She was becoming something else, something beyond the reach of their quiet moments together. And yet, despite the quiet ache in his chest, he didn't feel sorrow. He simply felt ready. "I know," he replied softly, his words carrying the same quiet understanding they had always shared. "I think it's time for both of us to move forward." Her fingers brushed against his, a fleeting touch, but one that carried more meaning than any words could express. It was a farewell of sorts, though neither of them acknowledged it. It wasn't about leaving, it was about growing, about stepping into the world that waited beyond the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, casting the world in a soft twilight, the boy realized that he wasn't losing her. They were simply finding their own paths, and those paths, though separate, would always carry the same quiet connection. The world was vast, full of possibilities, and both of them were on the cusp of something new. He stood and turned to her, offering a smile, though it was soft, unspoken. She smiled back, the kind of smile that carried 1,000 unspoken words. And just like that, she left. Not with a dramatic farewell, but with a quiet understanding that someday their paths would cross again. Perhaps not in the same way, perhaps not at the same time, but the bond they shared would remain, a thread that tied them together no matter where they went. The boy stood in the silence for a while, letting the world around him settle. His mind wandered back to the stone, to the ancient pulse he had felt in the clearing, to the quiet energy that still hummed beneath the surface of everything. The answers he had been seeking had never been about finding something distant or unreachable. They had always been about understanding the connection to everything around him. With a deep breath, he stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sky now filled with the first stars of the night. He knew that for now, his journey was his own to walk. The world was waiting, the quiet whispers of the earth, the stars, and the trees beckoning him forward. He didn't need to know where he was going or what he would find along the way. He simply needed to keep walking, to keep listening, and to trust that when the time was right, the answers would reveal themselves piece by piece, just as they always had. And so he took the first step, not toward something new, but toward a deeper understanding of what had always been there, waiting for him to see. The road ahead stretched out before him, long and open, though he couldn't see where it would lead. He didn't need to. For the first time he felt no rush, no sense of urgency. He walked slowly, feeling the earth beneath his feet, the coolness of the evening air, and the gentle pull of the world around him. Every step seemed to bring him closer, not to a destination, but to an understanding. He was no longer chasing answers, no longer reaching for something that felt just out of grasp. He was simply moving with the flow, letting the world carry him where it needed to go. The town was quieter than usual when he returned. It seemed as though everyone had taken their own steps away, each person drifting toward their own path, their own quiet unfolding. He passed familiar streets, the same houses he had seen every day, but now they felt different. The world had changed, or perhaps he had. The rhythm of his footsteps on the pavement was a soft reminder that the time for staying in one place had passed, and the time for moving forward had arrived. He didn't go to the library that day. Instead, he walked to the edge of town where the trees began to meet the open fields. The horizon stretched out before him, wide and endless, and he could almost feel the pull of it, beckoning him toward something just beyond his sight. It wasn't a place, not in the way he had once imagined. It was a feeling, an understanding that was now taking shape inside him. As he stood there, gazing at the land before him, he felt the quiet stir of something familiar. The wind carried with it the scent of earth, of grass, of the promise of something new. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting it fill him, letting it seep into his very bones. He felt no fear, no hesitation. Only the quiet knowledge that whatever was waiting for him, he was ready. He didn't know how long he stood there. The minutes seemed to blur into each other, the sky above shifting from light to dark as the stars began to emerge. He had always felt drawn to the stars, to the way they hung in the sky like silent witnesses to the passage of time. But tonight they felt different. Tonight they felt like a part of him, as if the threads of the universe were stretching out and connecting him to everything that had ever been, and everything that was yet to come. When he finally opened his eyes, the world felt softer, quieter. The air was thick with the same hum he had felt in the clearing, a presence that seemed to wrap itself around him, gentle but insistent. It wasn't a voice, not in the way he had once expected. It was a feeling, a connection that ran deeper than words. The world wasn't just a place to move through. It was a place to be with, to understand, to listen to. He turned away from the horizon and began to walk back toward the town, the quiet stillness of the night surrounding him. There was no hurry now, no need to rush. The answers would come when they were ready, and he would be there to listen. The road back home felt different too. The streets were no longer just familiar paths. They were part of something larger, part of the rhythm of the world that he had only just begun to understand. Every step he took now felt like a small part of a much bigger journey, one that didn't have an end but a continuous unfolding. By the time he reached his door, the night had fully settled in, the stars shining brightly above. He paused for a moment, standing in the doorway, taking in the stillness around him. The town, his home, the people he had known, they were all part of this quiet journey. But so was he, and he was ready to move forward, step by step, in whatever direction the world would take him. He stepped inside, the soft warmth of the house enveloping him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. The world was waiting, and he was ready to listen, to learn, and to step into whatever came next. Tomorrow would come, just as today had, and the day after that, and each one after that. There was no rush, no need to push for answers. The world would reveal itself when the time was right. And when it did, he would be ready to listen. The days that followed were soft, like the turn of a page, quiet and unhurried, each one settling into the next with an ease that felt both natural and reassuring. He moved through his routines with a steady calm, each moment unfolding as it always had, but now there was a deeper understanding beneath it all. He didn't chase time anymore. It came to him, passing like a gentle river, carrying him along its course without pushing or pulling, just letting him be. His sister had left, but her absence no longer felt like a void. It was more like the quiet space between breaths, a moment of stillness before something new arrived. He often thought of her, wondering where she was, what she was discovering, but he didn't feel the need to seek her out. He knew that in her own way, she was on her own journey, just as he was on his. Their paths were different, but that didn't mean they had to be separate. Sometimes, he thought, the space between people wasn't a distance, it was a place for growth, a quiet space where they could become who they were meant to be. The boy found himself returning often to the clearing in the woods. The stone, with its ancient pulse, was always there, waiting for him. He would sit beside it, tracing the worn surface with his fingers, letting the stillness of the place fill him. It was as if the stone held a memory, an echo of something ancient and unspoken, and in that silence he found something that had been missing from his life for so long. A quiet peace. One afternoon, as he sat there, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth, he heard the rustle of footsteps approaching. He looked up, not startled, but curious. There, emerging from the trees, was the librarian. The boy stood slowly, a sense of recognition flowing between them like an old friend returning home. "You've found it, haven't you?" the librarian said softly, his voice blending with the wind. The boy nodded, the words catching in his throat. He hadn't realized it until now, but the librarian had been there all along, not just as a guide, but as someone who had known the path before him, had walked it, and now waited for him to understand. "You've learned how to listen," the librarian continued, his gaze distant, as though seeing something far beyond the boy. "But now, you must learn how to move forward. The quiet you've found is only part of the journey. You must let it guide you, but not hold you still." The boy listened, feeling the weight of the librarian's words settle within him. He had always thought that stillness was the end of the path, the final destination where everything would make sense. But now he understood. Stillness was a beginning, a place to rest before continuing on. "I'm ready," the boy said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant by it. He only knew that it was true. The librarian smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You always were." With that, he turned and began to walk away, his footsteps light on the earth, fading into the trees. The boy stood for a long moment, watching him go, feeling a quiet gratitude swell within him. There was no grand revelation, No sudden burst of understanding. Only the quiet acknowledgement that everything he needed was already here. He had been listening for so long, and now he would follow where the path led. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and violet, the boy turned back toward the town. The sky, vast and endless, stretched before him, and he felt the pull of it, not as something far away, but as something that was already part of him. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't need to. He had learned that life unfolded in its own time, at its own pace, and all he had to do was listen, move forward, and trust that each step would take him exactly where he needed to go. And so, with the quiet hum of the world around him, he began to walk once more, not toward a destination, but toward the simple, steady unfolding of his own life. The path ahead was unclear, but that was part of its beauty. The journey, in its quiet way, was already beginning to reveal itself. The town seemed smaller as he walked through it, quieter in a way that felt familiar, like the calm before a storm that would never come. The streets were unchanged, the houses still standing in their steady rows, the sky still the same vast expanse above him. Yet something inside him had shifted, and with it, the way he saw everything around him. The rhythm of his footsteps echoed louder than it ever had before, a soft thrum against the hum of the world. He wasn't sure why it felt different, only that it did. And in that difference there was a kind of peace, a knowing that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The winds had picked up, swirling gently around him, lifting the leaves off the ground and sending them dancing through the air. The world seemed to be in movement, a quiet kind of motion, and he felt connected to it in a way that made his heart settle. He was no longer searching for something that would bring him answers. He had learned that answers, like the wind, were never found by chasing them. They were felt in the soft caress of the world, in the way everything moved together, each part playing its role in the quiet, unfolding dance of life. As he walked, he passed by the places that had once felt so full of meaning. The old market square, the small cafe by the corner, the stone well by the park. They were still there, their significance unchanged, but the boy realized that it wasn't the places themselves that had held meaning. It was the way he had seen them, the way he had connected with them in the quiet moments of his life. He could still see the memories, like faint echoes, the laughter of children in the street, the warmth of a shared cup of tea, the comforting silence of sitting with his sister. But now those memories didn't hold him in place. They had become part of the fabric of who he was, woven into the steady rhythm of his being. He had learned that it wasn't the things around him that needed to change, it was him. And in changing, he had found a different way to see the world, a different way to be in it. He didn't need to search for answers anymore. They were in the quiet spaces, in the moments when he wasn't looking for them, when he was simply living, walking, listening. The boy had always been a part of this world, just as much as the wind, the trees, the sky. He had just needed to remember that, needed to stop searching for something outside of himself and understand that everything he had been seeking had always been inside him. As the day began to fade into evening, he found himself standing at the edge of town again, looking out at the horizon where the sun was dipping low. The sky, painted in shades of violet and orange, seemed to stretch forever, a reminder of how vast the world truly was. But now, instead of feeling small in the face of it, he felt connected, a part of something much larger. He had always been part of this world, but now he understood how to move within it. The familiar quiet of the town seemed to wrap around him like a blanket, comforting in its steadiness. And as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the stars in the sky, the boy realized that this was enough. He had found peace, not in answers, but in the quiet understanding that life would continue to unfold, as it always had, in its own time. He was part of it, and that was enough. With a final glance at the stars above, he turned and began walking back, the soft rhythm of his steps guiding him home. The night was quiet, the world still, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his chest that he was not alone. Everything he had sought, everything he had wondered, was always here, woven into the fabric of the world, just waiting for him to see it. And now he could. The weeks that followed felt like a soft unfolding, like pages in a well-worn book that had been opened and closed so many times the edges were soft and familiar. The boy's life moved steadily, but it was no longer the same. He had learned to move with the rhythm of the world around him, not against it, and in doing so, everything seemed to fall into place, though it never arrived with a grand fanfare. There was no sudden moment of realization, no great shift in the air, just the quiet, steady pulse of life continuing its path. His sister hadn't returned, and the space she had left behind had grown quieter. But it didn't feel like a loss anymore. The absence was simply part of the larger story, and it had no power over him now. He understood that people came and went, paths diverged, and lives shifted, but the connection that remained between them, though not spoken, was always there, woven into the fabric of the world he was beginning to understand. One evening, as the sky deepened into night, the boy found himself standing at the edge of the same field where he had stood before, his gaze turned toward the horizon. The world had always seemed vast, but now it felt vast in a way that wasn't overwhelming. It was a space he was a part of, a place that wasn't distant or unreachable, but rather within his reach, ready to be explored. The stars above him, once distant points of light, now seemed like familiar friends, twinkling softly in the dark. He had not expected the pull of the world to feel so warm, so steady. Everything he had learned in the silence of the woods, in the pages of books, and in the soft presence of the people around him, had woven into something more than he could have imagined. It wasn't about the answers he had sought. It was about the act of seeking itself, of moving forward, of listening, of understanding that life was less about grasping and more about being. The path that had once seemed unclear now seemed full of quiet direction, though not in the way he had expected. There was no specific place to go, no destination to reach. It was the journey itself that mattered, the steps taken in the quiet confidence that came from within. He no longer felt the need to search for meaning. He had found it, not in the external world, but in the way he had learned to see it all. The world had always been offering its answers, but now he could listen and understand. He turned, his feet moving automatically, carrying him back toward town, back to the quiet spaces of home. He didn't rush. There was no need to. The pace of his walk was unhurried, and in its slowness he found a quiet peace. The air was cool against his skin, the night alive with the soft sounds of distant creatures and the rustle of trees. Each step felt like an acknowledgement of the life he had built, of the understanding he had found, and of the life that would continue to unfold. When he reached the door, the warmth of the house greeted him, the soft glow of light from within spilling onto the porch. He stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet welcoming him back. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He felt different, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet confidence that comes with knowing your place in the world. The small moments, the ones that had always seemed ordinary, now held meaning. They were part of something larger, part of the steady unfolding of life that continued, regardless of where one stood in it. He sat by the window, looking out at the night sky, the stars still twinkling in their silent dance. He didn't need to search for meaning anymore. He had found it in the stillness, in the spaces between words, in the way the world whispered its answers. And in that quiet understanding, he knew, without a doubt, that everything was exactly as it should be. The night stretched on, the world turning slowly as it always had, and he sat there, content, knowing that his journey would continue, step by quiet step. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew that whatever it was, he was ready. The answers would come, not in loud revelations, but in the steady rhythm of his own life. And with each step, he would learn to listen, to grow, and to continue moving forward. The quiet rhythm of the days continued, yet something was shifting within him. The boy had learned, in his own way, how to move through the world without needing to change everything around him. He had come to understand that the answers were never loud, never demanding. They were in the soft moments, the steady pace of his steps, the rustle of the leaves, the way the sun set each evening without fail. The world was unfolding, just as it always had, and he was learning to walk within it, to let it carry him instead of trying to force his way through it. One evening, as he stood in the doorway of his house, looking out at the familiar landscape, he noticed something. The stars seemed brighter that night, as though the sky had opened just a little wider, offering something he hadn't seen before. He didn't rush to meet it, though. He simply stood there, letting the stillness wash over him, letting the quiet pull of the world invite him without asking. It had been weeks since he had visited the stone in the woods, but tonight he felt the pull again. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't a call he had to answer right away. But it was there, a quiet whisper that hummed in the back of his mind, reminding him that the journey was ongoing, even if it was just a walk through the familiar woods. He stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin as he made his way through the town, now silent under the moonlight. His footsteps were soft on the earth, a steady rhythm that matched the steady pulse of his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he needed to walk, to follow the path that felt both old and new at the same time. The woods were just as he remembered, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting a soft glow on the forest floor. He felt, as he always did, a sense of belonging here. The quietness of the woods wrapped around him, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the present, only the steady sound of his breath and the gentle rustle of the leaves. When he reached the clearing, the stone was waiting for him, just as it had always been. He walked toward it slowly, his fingers brushing against the moss-covered surface. The stone had always felt like a part of the earth itself, like something ancient and enduring, holding the memories of countless years in its silent embrace. He sat down beside it, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle over him. There was no rush, no urgency to the moment. He had learned that the world didn't need to be fixed or changed. It was already perfect in its quiet imperfection. It was he who had changed, who had learned to listen, to be present, to move with the rhythm of life instead of against it. He didn't know how long he sat there, but eventually the night began to shift, the stars above him beginning to fade as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. It wasn't the dramatic change he had once expected, but a quiet unfolding, like the soft turn of a page in a book. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush forward. He didn't need to know what came next. He simply allowed himself to sit there, to breathe in the stillness, to trust that whatever was meant to come would come in its own time. As the sun began to rise, the boy stood, his feet planted firmly on the ground beneath him. He didn't feel the need to hurry back to the town. There was no destination to reach. The journey was enough. He walked back home slowly, the sky lightening with the first hues of the morning, the world around him waking up with quiet grace. And as he passed through the town, he felt, for the first time, completely at peace with where he was. The answers weren't in the destination. They were in the quiet, steady steps taken along the way. And with that, he knew, without a doubt, that he was exactly where he needed to be. The world would continue to unfold, and so would he, each step carrying him towards something greater, something deeper, though he didn't need to see it yet. It was enough to simply walk, to listen, and to trust that the journey would reveal itself one quiet step at a time. The rhythm of the days continued, though the boy found himself less and less caught up in the flow of time. Each moment, though familiar, carried with it a new kind of stillness, one that stretched out across his days like the horizon itself. He had learned to move with the world, not pushing against it, but letting it carry him forward. And yet there were still those moments when the pull of something deeper within him called, a quiet tug at his chest that reminded him there was more to understand, more to see. It wasn't an urgency he felt, no, not like before. It was a gentle curiosity, a soft stirring within him that seemed to grow the more he listened, the more he let the world breathe around him. One evening, after the sun had set and the stars were beginning to appear, he found himself standing at the edge of the field again, looking out at the vastness of the sky. There was something about the stars, the way they shimmered softly, as if they held all the mysteries of the universe. And for the first time, he truly understood that those mysteries didn't need to be solved, didn't need to be uncovered in any grand way. They simply existed, quiet and patient, waiting for him to grow into them. His steps were slow as he walked through the town, though tonight there was a subtle change in the air. He couldn't quite name it, but something felt different, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't yet see. It was the kind of feeling that settled in your chest, warm and soft, but with a slight pull, an invitation to pay attention, to open your heart a little wider. He passed by familiar places, shops that had stood still for as long as he could remember, the old oak tree in the park, its branches heavy with the weight of years. He no longer saw them as just objects in his world. Now they felt like quiet companions, waiting for him to notice the way they had stood by him, offering their steady presence through the years. The boy walked on, not rushing, but feeling the weight of each step, the quiet echo of his presence in the world around him. It was strange how everything had shifted, how the simplest moments now carried so much meaning, as if life had always been this rich, this full, but he had been too caught up in the noise to truly hear it. When he reached the edge of the town, he found himself standing at the same crossroads he had stood at so many times before. The path that led into the woods stretched before him, inviting him with its quiet promise. The boy had come here many times, but tonight it felt different. There was something in the air, something calling to him from beyond the trees. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he could feel it tugging at him, gently urging him forward. Without thinking, he stepped onto the familiar path, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the only sound in the stillness. As he walked deeper into the woods, the world around him seemed to quiet, the trees stretching high above him like silent guardians. The path ahead was the same as always, but tonight it felt like it was leading him somewhere new, to a place he hadn't yet reached. The deeper he went, the more the woods seemed to open up around him, as if the trees were shifting to make space for him. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was a sense of ease in the air, a quiet shift that made him feel as though the forest itself was welcoming him. He found himself drawn once more to the clearing, the place where the stone stood. As he approached, he noticed that the air here was different, the quiet pulse of the earth beneath him more pronounced than it had ever been. The stone was waiting, as it always had, its surface worn and weathered, its presence steady and unyielding. He sat beside it once again, letting the quiet of the clearing fill him. The sky above was a deep velvet, the stars twinkling softly as if they were whispering something just out of reach. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness, letting the world settle into him. And there, in the quiet of the night, he understood something he had always known but hadn't fully grasped. The journey wasn't about answers or destinations. It was about listening, about being present in the unfolding of each moment, and allowing the world to speak in its own time. The stone beside him seemed to hum softly, as though it were alive with all the memories it had held, all the stories it had witnessed over the years. And in that moment he felt connected, not just to the stone or the woods, but to the world itself, to the rhythm that had been unfolding long before he had ever learned to listen. He didn't need to know where the path would lead. He only needed to trust that each step, each moment, was enough. And with that, he stood, turning back toward the town, the quiet hum of the earth beneath his feet guiding him home. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he didn't need to. All that mattered was the journey, the quiet unfolding of each step along the way. As he walked back through the town, the world seemed to breathe with him, as if it were waiting for him to see the beauty in the small moments, the quiet rhythms that had always been there, just waiting to be noticed. The path ahead was still unclear, but he felt ready for it, knowing that with each step he would find the answers in their own time, not in a rush, but in the steady unfolding of his own life. The days that followed felt like they were stretching out before him, calm and steady, each one another quiet step in the journey he had come to understand so deeply. There was no sense of urgency in the air, no pressure to rush through the moments. Instead, the world seemed to move around him, like a gentle river carrying him forward, its current soft yet sure. He found himself wandering more frequently, walking not because he needed to go anywhere, but because the act of moving through the world felt grounding. Whether it was the quiet streets of the town or the familiar trails through the woods, he moved with a new understanding, one that no longer required answers, only presence. There was no destination, no ultimate goal. There was simply the rhythm of his life unfolding like a slow, steady song. Sometimes he would visit the clearing with the stone, its surface as worn as his own thoughts, and sit in its stillness, letting the quiet seep into him. The world around him had grown more vivid. Each rustling leaf, each passing breeze felt like a part of a larger conversation. And it wasn't a conversation that demanded anything from him. It simply was. And he, in turn, listened. It wasn't just in the clearing that he found his stillness. In the town, too, he noticed the small things. The way the light danced through the windows of the small cafe. The quiet murmur of conversations as people passed one another on the street. Every moment seemed to hold a quiet significance, as though the world itself was speaking, not in words, but in its rhythms. And he had learned to listen to those rhythms, to let them fill the spaces between his thoughts, between his steps. His sister, though still far from home, seemed to have found her own path as well. She wrote to him occasionally, her letters brief, but full of the same quiet reflection he had come to understand in himself. There was no need for lengthy explanations, no need to fill the pages with the things they had once thought were necessary. The words they shared now carried more meaning, less spoken and more felt, like the space between breaths. In her letters, he could sense her journey unfolding in the same way his own was, both separate and deeply intertwined. One morning, after the rain had passed and the world was left glistening in the soft light of dawn, the boy found himself standing by the window, watching the steam rise from the wet ground, the air fresh with the scent of earth and rain. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the quiet beauty of these simple moments until they were right in front of him. There was something profound in the stillness that followed the storm, something sacred in the way the world seemed to hold its breath just for a moment. He stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his skin, and made his way toward the woods. The path was familiar, though it felt different today, less like a route to somewhere, more like a continuation of the journey he had always been on. Each step felt deliberate, each breath felt deeper, and with each passing moment he found himself more deeply attuned to the world around him. When he reached the clearing, it was as if the world itself had opened wider for him. The stone was there, as always, but it didn't feel like it was waiting for him. It felt like he was already a part of it, as if his presence was as natural as the wind that stirred the leaves, as the sky that stretched endlessly above. There was no need to sit, no need to think. He simply stood there, grounded in the quiet pulse of the earth, feeling the steady thrum of life beneath his feet. For the first time he understood that he wasn't searching for something. He wasn't waiting for something to reveal itself. He was already part of it, already connected to everything around him in ways that could never fully be explained, only felt. The answers, he realized, had never been somewhere else. They had always been in the journey itself, in the listening, in the quiet act of moving forward without the need to control the direction. The world wasn't something to be understood or mastered. It was something to be experienced, to be a part of, just as it was. And in that moment, standing in the clearing, the boy felt a profound peace. He had always known this was the truth, but now, for the first time, he understood it fully. He didn't need to seek. He didn't need to find. He only needed to be, to listen, to walk in tune with the world as it unfolded around him. And as he turned to walk back, the path before him no longer seemed uncertain. It wasn't that he knew exactly where it would lead. It was that it didn't matter. Each step, each moment, was enough. That was the journey, and it was all he needed. The days continued to drift by, each one slipping quietly into the next. The boy, now deeply familiar with the rhythm of his life, moved through the world with a calm that surprised him. It wasn't that the world had become any less complicated, or that answers had appeared in any sudden burst of clarity. It was more that he had stopped looking for them. Instead, he simply existed in the space between moments, where life unfolded in its own time, and he had learned to trust that unfolding. There were still days when he felt the soft pull of something just beyond reach, an unspoken question, a lingering curiosity. But instead of rushing toward it, he allowed it to stay there, in the quiet corners of his mind, letting it breathe without the need to force an answer. Life, he had realized, was not something to solve. It was something to experience. One morning, as the sunlight filtered softly through the trees, casting long shadows across the town, the boy found himself drawn, once again, to the edge of the woods. He didn't know why. It wasn't as if something was waiting for him there. He simply felt the call to walk, to continue moving forward, even if he didn't fully understand where he was going. The path was familiar, the same one he had walked countless times before, but today it felt different, as if the woods themselves were inviting him deeper. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the quiet buzz of life in the trees surrounded him, creating a sense of peace that settled deep in his chest. He didn't hurry. Each step felt like a slow unfolding, a rhythm he had come to know well. And as he moved further into the woods, the silence around him deepened, wrapping around him like a cloak. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty, though. It felt full, alive, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. When he reached the clearing, the stone was there, as it always had been. But today, it didn't feel like a marker or a stopping point. It felt like a continuation of everything he had learned. The boy didn't sit beside it this time. He stood, letting the soft wind stir around him, his eyes closed for a moment as he took in the world. There was no grand revelation, no sudden clarity. There was only a deep, quiet understanding that everything had always been exactly as it needed to be. The questions that had once seemed so urgent, so important, now felt distant, like things left behind on a road that no longer needed to be traveled. He had learned to trust that life would reveal itself in its own time. He didn't need to know the path. He only needed to walk it. He stayed in the clearing for a long time, not thinking, not waiting, just being. The silence around him was no longer something he sought to break, but something he had come to embrace. It was in the silence that he found his answers, in the space between thoughts, in the steady rhythm of his breathing. When he finally turned to leave, he did so without hesitation. There was no sense of finality, no feeling that he was leaving something behind. Instead, there was only the quiet certainty that he was moving forward, not towards something, but with the world as it continued to unfold around him. The path back to town was just as familiar, yet now it felt like the beginning of something new. The boy knew that he didn't need to understand what came next. He had learned, through the stillness, through the quiet moments, that life would reveal itself piece by piece at its own pace. And so he walked home, his steps steady and sure, not searching, not rushing, simply moving with the flow of life, knowing that in each moment he was exactly where he needed to be. The world was waiting, but there was no hurry. He would arrive when the time was right. And until then he would continue walking, continuing to listen, continuing to be. The days moved on with the same quiet rhythm, each one blending seamlessly into the next. The boy had stopped trying to rush through time, no longer chasing after answers or solutions. He found that, in the quiet stillness, the world revealed itself in ways he hadn't expected. The small, unnoticed moments now held a quiet power, and he had come to appreciate them for what they were. A series of steps that led him further into a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. There were mornings when he would wake before the sun, stepping out into the cool, damp air with no destination in mind. He simply walked, letting his thoughts settle as he moved through the town, through the woods, through the small streets he had known all his life. The world felt at once familiar and new, as if he were seeing it for the first time. The light of early morning cast everything in a soft glow, the trees whispering as the wind moved through their branches, the earth beneath him solid and steady. It was on one of these walks, as he wandered farther into the woods than usual, that he found himself standing at a place he had never noticed before. The trees here were different, older, their trunks thick and twisted, as if they had been shaped by centuries of the same quiet winds. The boy stepped closer, his fingers brushing lightly against the bark, feeling its rough surface beneath his touch. For a moment he stood there, his breath slow and even, letting the quiet of the forest settle around him. It wasn't a loud moment, not one that demanded attention, but it held a presence that felt significant. He closed his eyes for a moment, the wind brushing against his face, the scent of pine and earth thick in the air. It was as though the woods themselves were speaking to him, not in words, but in the soft hum of life that pulsed through every leaf, every branch. When he opened his eyes again, he saw something he hadn't expected. Just beyond the trees, tucked away in a small clearing, there was a stone. It wasn't as large or imposing as the one in the clearing where he had often sat, but it felt just as ancient, just as steady. The stone seemed to glow faintly in the dappled light, its surface worn smooth by time, and for a moment the boy stood still, watching it. He walked toward it, his steps light, feeling the pull of the stone as if it had been waiting for him all this time. When he reached it, he placed his hand gently on its surface, letting the quiet of the moment settle into him. The stone didn't speak, didn't reveal any new truth, but as his fingers traced its edges, he felt a sense of peace wash over him, as though it were another part of the world that had always been there, quietly awaiting his attention. In that moment, he understood something that had been with him all along, something he had only now begun to grasp. The journey was not about reaching some far-off destination or finding something that would make everything clear. It was about being present, about noticing the world for what it was in each moment, without the need for answers, without the need to understand everything all at once. The answers were in the living, in the walking, in the breathing. He stood by the stone for what felt like an eternity, though it was only a few minutes, his mind quiet and still, not needing to seek, not needing to find. He simply was. And in that stillness he found everything he needed. When he finally turned to leave, he didn't feel as though he were leaving something behind. The stone, the trees, the air, they weren't separate from him. They were all part of the same rhythm, the same unfolding that had carried him to this moment. He walked back through the woods, the path feeling even more familiar now, as though it, too, had always been waiting for him to see it. By the time he reached the town, the sun had fully risen, casting the world in its golden light. Everything felt just as it always had, steady, unchanged. But there was a new understanding in the boy's heart. He wasn't waiting for something to change anymore. He was simply living, moving through the world, letting it unfold without the need to force it. And in that quiet acceptance, in that steady rhythm, he found peace. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't need to. The journey was enough. Each step, each moment was exactly what it needed to be. And with that quiet certainty, he walked on. The days blended together in a way that felt both familiar and new. The boy had long since stopped measuring time in the way he once had, no longer counting days or moments with the urgency that used to mark his every step. Now, each day seemed to unfold in its own time, a steady current that he allowed to carry him forward without resistance. There was no hurry, no destination to reach. He simply moved with the world, letting it guide him, letting each moment be enough. As the seasons shifted, the air grew cooler, and the leaves began to change their colors. The boy found himself walking through the town more often, though it was no longer with the same aimlessness that had once characterized his walks. There was a quiet purpose to his steps now, a sense of knowing that whatever came next would be met with open hands. The world had become something he felt deeply connected to, not because he had to, but because he simply was a part of it. The rhythm of life around him was no longer something to chase, but something to flow with. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets, the boy found himself standing at the edge of the town again, looking out at the distant horizon. He had stood here many times before, but today it felt different. The land stretched out before him, vast and open, and he could see the endless sky meeting the earth in a gentle curve. It was a quiet, timeless moment, one that seemed to hold everything he had learned, everything he had come to understand in its soft embrace. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and as he exhaled, he felt something shift within him. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to make him pause. For a brief moment, the world around him seemed to blur, the edges of everything softening, until all that was left was the feeling of being, of existing in this very moment. The boy didn't move for a long time, standing there at the edge of the town, his thoughts quiet, his heart steady. He had no need to search for answers anymore. The world had revealed itself to him in ways he had never expected, not with grand gestures or loud revelations, but in the soft, everyday moments that had always been there. It was in the way the wind whispered through the trees, the way the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the way his own heartbeat echoed in the stillness. He was no longer looking for something outside himself. The journey was not about finding anything, it was about understanding that everything he had been seeking had always been here, woven into the very fabric of his life. It was then that he noticed the path that led into the woods, winding its way through the trees, just as it had always done. But today it looked different to him. Not in any obvious way, but in the quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead was exactly where he needed to be. The path was not a destination to reach, it was simply a continuation of the journey he had already begun. Without thinking, he started walking, his steps steady and sure as he moved deeper into the woods. The air was cooler now, the ground beneath his feet soft with fallen leaves, the familiar sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustling of leaves, the distant creak of branches filled the silence around him. He felt at peace here, as though the woods were holding him, guiding him forward with a quiet presence that was both grounding and freeing. As he walked, he didn't think about where the path was taking him. He didn't need to. The journey was enough. The quiet hum of the world around him, the rhythm of his steps, the steady beat of his heart. These were all he needed. And in that moment, he understood that he was already where he needed to be, that every step he had taken, every moment he had lived, had led him to this place of quiet understanding. He didn't know how far he walked, nor did it matter. When the trees began to thin and the clearing appeared before him, he paused, standing at the edge of it. The stone was there, as it always had been, its surface weathered and worn, yet as steady and enduring as ever. It was no longer a marker on his journey, but a part of it. The boy approached it slowly, his fingers brushing against the stone's surface, feeling the coolness of it beneath his touch. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the clearing settle around him, feeling the weight of everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. And in that moment, he realized something simple, yet profound. It was not the destination that mattered, but the journey itself. The stone, the path, the moments along the way, they were all part of the same rhythm, part of the same unfolding. And in that quiet, steady unfolding, he had found everything he needed. The boy stood for a long time, breathing in the stillness, letting it fill him. He didn't need to know what came next. He didn't need to understand everything. He had learned to move through the world without the weight of expectation, without the need for answers. All he had to do was keep walking, keep listening, and trust that the journey would reveal itself in its own time. And with that he turned, his footsteps light and sure, and began walking back, not toward a destination, but into the flow of life that would continue to unfold before him. The path back to town was the same, yet somehow different, as though the air itself had changed in the time he had spent in the woods. There was a stillness to it now, an underlying peace that seemed to follow him like a shadow, settling deeper within him with each step. It wasn't as though the world had transformed. It was more that he had begun to see it in a new light, a soft clarity that allowed him to appreciate the quiet beauty in every moment. As he walked, the sound of his footsteps on the familiar path felt less like a movement through space and more like a continuation of something he had always been a part of. It was almost as if the road itself was welcoming him back, as though the rhythm of his life, however simple, had always belonged to this very place. The town came into view, its small buildings framed against the horizon, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It seemed quieter than usual, the sounds of life muted in a way that felt both soothing and strange. He had walked this road so many times, yet tonight there was something different in the air, something that made him stop for a moment before stepping through the town's gates. The streets were nearly empty, the familiar faces of townspeople absent, as if the town itself had retreated into silence, just for a while. He had learned not to search for meaning in everything, not to look for grand signs in moments that were simply the world unfolding as it always had. But tonight, he couldn't help but feel that something was quietly shifting, that the air itself was filled with an unspoken promise, a slow turning towards something new. When he reached the center of town, he paused outside the cafe, the one he had passed so many times before. The door was slightly ajar, a soft light spilling out onto the cobbled street. He hadn't expected anyone to be inside, not at this hour, but as he looked through the window, he saw someone sitting at the counter, a woman he didn't recognize. She was hunched over a cup of tea, her face partially obscured by the shadows, but something about her presence felt significant, as though she had been waiting there just for him. There was no immediate reason to approach her, no pull to step inside, but something in the quiet stillness of the town seemed to draw him in. Without fully understanding why, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The soft jingle of the bell above the door broke the silence, and the woman looked up, her eyes meeting his with an unexpected familiarity, as if they had known each other for a long time. But it wasn't a recognition of faces. It was something deeper, a connection beyond the usual bounds of time and place. "Come, sit," she said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. He hesitated for only a moment before walking toward her, his steps light on the wooden floor. He sat, the quiet of the cafe wrapping around them like a soft blanket, the faint hum of life outside the walls fading into the background. The woman didn't speak at first, allowing the silence to settle, but there was something in the way she watched him, something that felt less like observation and more like understanding. "I've been waiting for you," she said at last, her voice soft but certain. "Not in the way that time waits, but in the way that knowing waits. You've been listening, haven't you?" The question hung in the air between them, its weight soft but steady, like the steady pull of the earth beneath his feet. He nodded, though he wasn't sure what she meant, wasn't sure how to respond. He had listened to the world, to the stillness, to the spaces between the moments. but her words felt like a key, turning, unlocking something inside him. "Everything is unfolding as it should," she continued, her gaze never leaving his. "But sometimes, when we are ready, the world shows us what we cannot see on our own. Tonight it is time to see." Her words were simple, but they carried a quiet depth that seemed to stir something within him. He had always felt as though the journey was a path he walked alone, even when he wasn't physically alone. But now, sitting across from this woman, he felt the quiet presence of something larger, something that had been guiding him all along. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask her who she was, what she meant, but the words caught in his throat. There was no need for questions, not now. The answers weren't something that could be spoken. They were something that could only be felt, only understood when the time was right. The woman smiled softly as though she knew exactly what he was thinking, as though the understanding was already there, waiting to be discovered. "Go when you're ready. The journey continues, but you've learned what you need to learn. The world is waiting for you, just as you are." He didn't know how long they sat in silence, but eventually the moment seemed to reach its natural end. He stood slowly, feeling no sense of rush, no sense of urgency. The door opened again, and the soft night air greeted him like an old friend. He turned to face the woman once more, but she was already gone, as if she had never been there at all. And yet he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel lost or uncertain. He felt, for the first time, fully aware of the world around him, fully aware of the journey he had been on, and the journey still ahead. The path ahead was still unknown, but it didn't need to be. He didn't need to know the destination. He had learned to trust the quiet rhythm of the world, to trust the unfolding of each moment. He stepped outside, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and for the first time in a long while he felt a deep, quiet peace. The world was waiting, as it always had been, and he was ready to walk with it, step by step, into whatever came next. The quiet peace from the cafe lingered as the boy walked through the town, the air cool against his skin, the evening sun casting long shadows over the streets. The events of the past days, weeks, months seemed to be settling into something that made sense, even though he couldn't fully articulate what that something was. It wasn't clarity in the traditional sense, but a deeper understanding that didn't require explanation, just presence. The world was unfolding in a way he no longer needed to question. He passed through the familiar streets, his footsteps steady on the cobbled pavement. But tonight, the town felt different. The houses, the quiet lanes, the trees that lined the pathways, all of it seemed to hum with a soft energy that was both new and ancient, as though everything had always been waiting for him to see it in this way. He had always felt connected to the town, to the woods, to the rhythms of his life, but now it was as though the connection had deepened, woven into something larger, something more expansive. It wasn't that he saw everything through a different lens, but more that he understood the lens itself, the way the world was built, from the smallest moments, the quiet exchanges, the way the wind carried stories through the trees. Every place he walked, every face he passed now felt like a part of the same unfolding story. His place in it wasn't defined by time, by an endpoint, or by the pursuit of something distant. It was defined by the experience itself, the listening, the living, the simple act of being. His path led him, almost without thinking, back toward the woods. The forest had always been his sanctuary, a place of quiet refuge, where the world seemed to slow, where the rhythm of his thoughts could align with the rhythm of the earth. He walked toward the familiar clearing, not with the expectation of finding something new, but with the understanding that the act of walking of simply being in that place was enough. As he entered the clearing, the stone stood before him, just as it always had. But now it was not a symbol of something to be sought after or understood. It was just there, as part of the landscape, a quiet witness to the world around it. He reached out and placed his hand on its surface once again, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his fingers, but there was no search for meaning this time. There was no need to find anything. The answers weren't hidden within the stone, nor in the trees, nor in the spaces between the moments. They were simply present in the quiet acceptance of everything that already was. He sat there for a while, the night creeping slowly over the land, the first stars twinkling softly above. The world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something that had already happened. There was nothing to rush, no urgency to fill the silence with thought or action. Just being was enough. When he stood again and began to walk back, he didn't feel as though he was leaving something behind. He felt as though he was carrying it with him, part of the fabric of his life, woven into his steps. His movements were light, not with the weight of the past, but with the understanding that the past had shaped him without holding him in place. The future, too, would unfold, but there was no need to chase it. It would come, as it always did, in its own time. He passed through the town again, the streets quieter now, but the familiar faces of the people he knew remained just as steady as before. There was no sense of expectation, no feeling of unfinished business. He had learned that everything would find its place in time, that he was part of something much larger than the small details that once consumed him. The world moved at its own pace, and he was learning to move with it, not against it. By the time he reached home, the air had grown still, the night fully settled in. The world outside seemed distant, though not in an unsettling way. It felt more like a part of him now, a quiet hum beneath the surface of everything. He didn't need to search for meaning in the spaces between the stars or in the patterns of his life. It was all there, already unfolding in its quiet, natural way. As he closed the door behind him, he felt no need to fill the silence with words or thoughts. The journey was already unfolding, not because he had found the answers, but because he had learned to live with the questions, to trust the rhythm of life without forcing it. And in that trust he found everything he needed. Tomorrow would come, just as it always had, and he would be ready to meet it, not with the need to understand it all, but with the quiet certainty that each step would carry him exactly where he needed to be. And that, he realized, was enough. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next, like soft strokes of paint on a canvas. The boy had stopped measuring time by the ticking of the clock or the turning of the calendar pages. Each moment felt full in itself, not waiting for the next or trying to escape the last. There was a quiet peace in this steady flow, a comfort in knowing that the world moved with a rhythm all its own, and he had learned to move with it. He found himself walking less these days, not because he felt the need to escape, but because he had begun to understand that there was nothing to run from. The town, the woods, the clearing with the stone, everything was already part of him, woven into the very fabric of his existence. He could feel it in the air, in the subtle changes of the seasons, in the quiet conversations he had with the people who passed through his life. He had learned, perhaps more deeply than he had realized, to trust that life would unfold in its own time, in its own way. But even with this peace settled in him, there were still moments of quiet longing, moments when he would look out at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond, wondering if there was more to discover. It wasn't a restless desire to change or a hunger for adventure. It was something softer, something that came from a quiet curiosity about the world beyond what he had already known. The world was vast, and he had only just begun to see it for what it was. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in warm, golden light, the boy found himself drawn to the edge of the woods again. He didn't know why exactly, but there was something in the air that seemed to call him back to that familiar path. Maybe it was the way the trees looked in the soft glow of dusk, or the quiet sound of the wind rustling through their leaves. Whatever it was, he felt the pull, gentle but insistent, like a quiet invitation to return. He walked the path slowly, not rushing, allowing the moment to unfold around him. The familiar rhythm of his steps, the soft crunch of the leaves beneath his feet, felt grounding, like a reminder that everything he needed was already here, in the world around him. He didn't need to go anywhere or search for something new. The answers were in the simple act of moving through the world, of being present in it, not as a spectator, but as a participant in the quiet dance of life. When he reached the clearing, he stopped for a moment, taking in the familiar sight. The stone, still there as it had always been, stood in the center of the clearing, its surface worn and weathered by time. It was no longer a marker for something he was searching for. It was just a part of the landscape, a piece of the quiet rhythm that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He sat down beside it, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his fingertips. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the silence deepening around him. There was no urgency now, no need to force anything. He simply sat there, letting the stillness fill him, letting it settle into his bones. The world was exactly as it needed to be, and he, too, was exactly as he needed to be. It was in this moment of quiet that the thought came to him, almost unexpectedly. He had stopped looking for answers because he had realized that the journey was the answer. He had always thought that there was something out there, something he needed to find, some hidden truth that would explain everything. But now he understood that the truth wasn't something to be discovered, it was something to be lived. It was in the quiet moments, in the steady rhythm of his life, in the way the world unfolded around him, day by day. As the light began to fade, he stood slowly, stretching his arms above his head, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs. He had learned that he didn't need to rush forward, didn't need to chase the future. The journey would reveal itself in its own time, and when the moment came, he would be ready. There was no destination. There was only the path, and he was already walking it. With that quiet understanding, he turned back toward the town, the path ahead bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The world was still vast, still full of the unknown, but he no longer felt the need to understand it all at once. He would continue walking step by step, each moment unfolding with its own quiet purpose. And with each step, he would listen, and he would be present, knowing that life in all its simplicity and complexity would guide him where he needed to go. And so, with the night falling softly around him, he walked on. The quiet of the town wrapped itself around him like an old blanket, familiar and comforting, but with the hint of something new, something waiting just beyond the edges of his awareness. The boy moved through it without hurry, though each step felt more deliberate, as though the ground beneath him had begun to feel different. It wasn't just the familiar roads or the houses he passed by, it was the air itself, charged with a quiet energy that seemed to speak in the spaces between moments. The pull to the woods had become a regular part of his days, not out of any necessity, but because he had learned to trust that the journey was as much about the pauses as it was about the movement. And so, with each visit to the clearing, with each moment spent by the stone, he found himself not seeking something new, but simply being present, letting the world unfold in its own time, without the need for answers or urgency. As the days wore on, the boy found his connection to the world around him growing deeper, more intimate. He was no longer simply walking through it. He was part of it. The trees, the wind, the people he passed. He could feel the quiet pulse of life in everything. And yet, with all this connection, there was still the quiet question that lingered just out of reach, like a distant melody he couldn't quite hear. It was early one morning, just before dawn, when the boy found himself standing at the edge of the woods again. The sky was still dark, the first whispers of light just beginning to edge the horizon. The world felt suspended in that moment, as though time had stopped, waiting for him to take the next step. He could feel the familiar pull of the forest, but it wasn't the same as it had been before. This time it felt like a beckoning, as if something was calling him to move forward, to go deeper than he had before. He stepped onto the path, his footsteps soft on the earth, and began to walk. The air was cool, the scent of the earth heavy with the dampness of the night. The woods seemed quieter than usual, as though everything was holding its breath, waiting for him. With each step, the path seemed to open up before him, as if the woods themselves were guiding him, leading him somewhere he hadn't yet seen. The deeper he walked, the more the familiar sounds of the forest seemed to fade into the background. There was a stillness. Around him, a quiet that settled into his bones. And yet there was something electric in the air, something alive that made him feel both grounded and weightless at once. As he reached a point in the woods he had never ventured to before, he came across something he hadn't expected. A clearing, different from the one with the stone. It was larger, the trees surrounding it taller, their branches weaving together to form a natural canopy. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft rays, casting the ground in patches of golden light. And in the center of the clearing there was another stone. This one was larger, its surface rougher, its edges jagged as though it had been shaped by something far older than the world around it. The boy approached it slowly, his heart beating just a little faster now. There was something different about this stone, something that felt like a silent invitation, a whisper in the wind that he couldn't quite understand, but knew he had to answer. He placed his hand on its surface, and for a moment he felt the earth beneath him stir. It wasn't the same pull he had felt with the first stone, but something deeper, something that seemed to reach into him like a forgotten memory trying to surface. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. Instead, he simply stood there, hand resting on the stone, feeling the quiet pulse of the earth beneath his fingertips. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and in that waiting, he realized something profound. He didn't need the answers, not right now, not in this moment. He didn't need to understand. All he needed to do was feel, to listen to the world as it whispered its secrets in the quietest of ways. As he stood there, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting the clearing in a soft, warm glow. It was as though the world had decided that in this moment everything was exactly as it should be. The stone, the forest, the quiet stillness of the morning, they were all part of the same unfolding. And as the boy slowly stepped back, he understood that he didn't need to rush forward or search for answers anymore. The answers would come when the time was right, in their own way, in their own time. With that quiet understanding, he turned and began to walk back through the woods. The path, though still unfamiliar in some places, no longer felt uncertain. It was simply a path like the one he had walked countless times before, and it would lead him exactly where he needed to go. Each step was enough, each moment was enough, and in that he found peace. The journey was ongoing, but there was no need to hurry. It was unfolding at its own pace, and that was exactly as it should be. The days continued their slow unfolding, each one carrying him deeper into the quiet rhythm of his life. There was a gentle certainty to it now, an acceptance that everything was as it should be, even when it seemed unclear. The boy no longer felt the need to chase moments or answers to try and force the world to reveal its truths. It wasn't about finding something outside of himself anymore. It was about being present, allowing life to weave its patterns at its own pace. The town felt more like a backdrop now, a quiet space in which he moved without urgency, his steps no longer driven by a need for discovery, but by the simple act of living. The woods, the clearing, the stone, all of them were no longer separate from him. They were part of him, as much a part of his existence as the air he breathed or the thoughts that drifted through his mind. He had come to understand that everything was connected, a quiet, ongoing dance between the world and himself, between all that was seen and all that remained hidden. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a rich shade of amber, the boy found himself standing at the edge of the town, once again looking out over the fields that stretched into the horizon. The world was quiet, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind through the tall grass. He had stood here so many times before, but tonight it felt different. The air seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as though the very earth beneath him was alive with the passage of time, with the stories that had been told and those that had yet to be written. He didn't know what had changed, but something in the stillness of the evening made him feel that he had reached another turning point in his journey. Not a dramatic shift, not a revelation, but something deeper, something that settled into him with the weight of knowing without understanding. It wasn't about moving forward, but about being where he was in the moment and allowing the world to continue unfolding in its own time. He walked slowly, his feet carrying him down the familiar path that led toward the woods. The shadows of the trees stretched long and dark as the sun sank lower and the first stars began to peek out in the fading light. Each step felt like a soft pulse, in tune with the rhythm of the earth beneath him, as though he were a part of something much larger than himself, something that had always been there, waiting for him to notice it. As he reached the clearing, he stood still for a moment, taking in the familiar sight. The stone, though worn by time, still stood in the center, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. He had come here many times, but tonight it felt different. The quiet that surrounded it, the stillness of the air, seemed to invite him to sit and listen, to be fully present with the moment. He lowered himself to the ground, sitting cross-legged beside the stone, his hands resting gently in his lap. The sky above was deepening into night, the stars, brighter now, scattered across the expanse like scattered jewels. There was no need for thought, no need for questions. He simply sat, breathing in the quiet, letting the world move around him without the need to grasp at it. For the first time, in a long while, he felt the weight of everything fall away. There was no more searching, no more trying to understand the mysteries of the world. There was simply the being, the quiet, unspoken presence that connected him to everything around him. The stone, the trees, the sky. They weren't separate from him. They were part of him, part of the quiet rhythm of his life. As the hours passed, the world shifted again, the night deepening, the air cooling. He didn't know how long he had sat there, lost in the stillness of the moment. But when he finally stood and turned to leave, there was no sense of loss, no feeling of unfinished business. The stone, the clearing, the woods, they would still be there, waiting for him, just as they always had been. And in that quiet certainty, he felt something settle inside him, as though he had come full circle in the journey he had been on all along. He walked back to the town, the path ahead now bathed in the soft light of the rising moon. The world was the same, and yet it felt somehow different. It was as though he had seen it for the first time, or perhaps had seen it more clearly than ever before. The rhythm of his life, the quiet pulse of the world was unfolding as it always had, and he was a part of it. There was no need to rush. There was no destination to reach. The journey was already enough. And with that quiet understanding, he walked on, his steps light and sure, carrying him into whatever came next, one moment at a time. The quiet hum of life continued to unfold, and with each passing day, the boy found that he was no longer searching. There were no more frantic questions, no desperate need to uncover some hidden truth or discover some forgotten mystery. Instead, he simply existed, moving through the world with a calm acceptance that filled him in ways he hadn't fully understood before. The townspeople went about their routines, the seasons shifted in their own time, and the woods stood as they always had, waiting, ever patient, a quiet witness to the passing of time. The boy spent most of his days in the town, walking the streets, sitting by the window in his small home, watching the light shift through the trees. There was a subtle beauty in the ordinary now, something that had once escaped him in his search for meaning. Now, everything seemed to carry a quiet significance. The laughter of children as they played in the streets, the sound of the wind through the leaves, the soft murmur of voices in the town square, they all felt like small, sacred parts of a larger whole, a whole that he was deeply a part of. He often found himself drawn back to the clearing where the stone had always stood. There was something about that place, something about the stillness of it that continued to call to him. But each time he visited, it felt different. The stone no longer seemed like a marker of something to be found. It was simply a part of the landscape, a part of the rhythm of life that continued to unfold around him. He would sit beside it, listening to the whisper of the wind, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his fingers. But there was no sense of longing anymore, no sense of searching. There was only the quiet presence of being. It was one such evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, that the boy found himself standing once again at the edge of the town. His footsteps carried him down the familiar road, though this time there was something different in the air. It wasn't an overwhelming feeling, not a dramatic change, but a subtle shift, a quiet shift that seemed to ripple through the world around him. It was as if the world, having unfolded so patiently, was now gently asking him to take another step, to move forward in a new direction. Without thinking, he made his way toward the woods once again, the familiar path opening before him, the trees arching above him like silent guardians. The wind stirred the leaves, and the sound of the forest filled the air, soft, steady, unhurried. The path felt the same as it had many times before, but tonight there was a new depth to it, as though the earth beneath his feet was inviting him to go further, to see more than he had seen before. As he moved deeper into the woods, the air grew cooler, and the light began to shift, the fading glow of the sunset giving way to the soft darkness of night. The familiar rustling of the leaves seemed to take on a new sound, a deeper resonance that seemed to echo in his chest. The boy didn't feel lost, but he did feel drawn to something new, something he had not yet discovered. It wasn't a destination, not in the way he once thought of it. It was more like an invitation, a beckoning to continue moving forward, even when the path ahead was unclear. When he arrived at the clearing, he found that the stone was no longer the focal point. It was still there, solid and enduring, but it no longer carried the same weight. Instead, the boy found himself drawn to the space around it, the way the trees framed the clearing, the soft hum of the night, the feeling of the earth beneath him. It was as though the entire forest, the entire world, was inviting him to see it with fresh eyes, to let go of the search for something outside of himself, and instead simply be with the world, as it was in that moment. He sat in the grass, feeling the coolness of the earth seep into his skin, the quiet buzz of the world moving around him. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he were part of something much larger than himself, not as a searcher, but as a participant, simply being present in the unfolding of life. The stone, the trees, the wind, they weren't separate from him. They were a part of him, just as he was a part of them. And in that quiet understanding, he realized that he had found exactly what he had been looking for all along. It wasn't answers, it wasn't revelations. It was the simple act of being, of allowing the world to unfold at its own pace, without the need to control it, to rush it. The journey wasn't about reaching a destination, but about experiencing each moment for what it was, about finding the quiet beauty in the spaces between the steps. As the night deepened around him, the boy stood slowly, his heart light, his mind clear. The world was still vast, still full of the unknown, but it no longer felt distant or out of reach. He wasn't chasing it anymore. He was simply walking with it, one step at a time, knowing that every step was enough. With a final glance at the clearing, the stone, and the stars above, he turned and began walking back through the woods, the path ahead still unknown but no longer something to fear. The rhythm of his steps carried him forward, and with each one he felt more and more at peace with the world as it was. It was no longer a question of what was to come. It was a quiet acceptance of what was already here. And in that acceptance he found everything he needed. The boy moved through the days with a quiet grace that felt less like a skill and more like a natural unfolding, as though the world itself had gently guided him to this place. He no longer needed to rush through each moment to search for something that might be just out of reach. There was peace now, a deep contentment in simply being, in allowing the world to pass by without needing to understand every part of it. As the days turned into weeks, the rhythm of his life felt more and more connected to the earth beneath his feet, the air he breathed, the quiet hum of the world around him. He no longer saw the trees as distant witnesses to time. He felt as if they were breathing with him, as if their roots ran deep with his own. The people of the town moved through their lives, and though he interacted with them, he knew now that the conversations, the exchanges, the smiles, they were all part of the same movement, the same unfolding that had been guiding him all along. One evening, as the sunset cast long shadows over the streets, the boy found himself standing in the town square, just watching the people pass by. It was a peaceful moment, one where time seemed to slow, allowing him to take in everything, the colors of the sky, the soft murmur of voices, the way the light shifted across the buildings. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was waiting for anything. He didn't feel the need to go anywhere or do anything. He was just here, and it was enough. The quiet stillness of that moment, however, was interrupted when he noticed something that caught his attention. A familiar face walking across the square, someone he hadn't seen in a long time. It was his sister. She was moving toward him, her steps slow and purposeful, but her gaze focused on something ahead of her. There was a certain weight to her presence, a quiet determination that had always marked her, but now it seemed softened, as though she had come to understand something in herself that had been elusive before. The boy didn't move immediately. He simply watched her approach, feeling a sense of recognition stir within him, though he couldn't name it. He had known, somewhere deep inside, that she would return, though he hadn't expected it to be like this. Quiet, unannounced, yet full of the same sense of coming home that he had felt in the moments of stillness he had spent in the woods. When she reached him, she paused for a moment, her gaze meeting his. For a long while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward, but it was full of the weight of time, of everything that had passed between them in the days and months before. "I've been thinking," she said, finally, her voice soft, almost hesitant, "about everything, about where I've been, about what I've been searching for. And I think I understand now. Or at least I'm starting to." The boy nodded, his heart quiet. There was no rush for answers, no need to fill the silence with explanations. He knew, in the same way he had come to understand everything else, that she too had been walking her own path, one that had led her to this point. And like him, she didn't need to say everything aloud. There was no need for all the words to be spoken. "I'm glad you're back," he said simply, his voice steady, and in it there was no judgment, no expectation, only the quiet acknowledgement of her presence, of the journey that had led her here, and of the quiet unfolding that had brought them both to this place. She smiled, though it was soft, like a small, quiet exhale. I think I'm ready to keep walking, with you, not ahead, not behind, but together." And there it was, the thing he hadn't realized he had been waiting for, not an answer, not a solution, but a shared understanding. A recognition that the journey was not something either of them had to walk alone, and that there was no need to rush to the end because they had already arrived. Together they stood there, in the quiet of the town square, the fading light of the day stretching long behind them. There was no need to move on yet. No need to speak. They were simply there, in the same quiet rhythm of life, each one feeling the steady pulse of the world around them. And in that shared silence the boy knew that the next steps, whatever they might be, would come as naturally as the last had. With a final, unspoken understanding, they began to walk together. The town, the trees, the earth. They all seemed to welcome them as they moved, side by side, into whatever came next, knowing that the path was just a continuation of everything that had come before. The journey was never really about reaching the end. It was about being present, moving forward, and trusting that life, in its quiet unfolding, would always lead them exactly where they needed to go. As they walked side by side, the world seemed to open up in subtle ways, its quiet beauty becoming more apparent with each step. The boy had never realized how much he had missed this simple, shared experience of moving through the world with another person. His sister's presence beside him wasn't loud, wasn't marked by grand gestures or heavy words. It was simply there, a quiet harmony that matched the rhythm of his own thoughts, like the soft hum of the earth beneath their feet. They didn't talk much at first, but the silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt like a shared understanding, like they were both simply enjoying the space they occupied together. The streetlights of the town flickered softly in the growing dusk, and the sounds of the world around them, the distant chatter of people, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, felt distant and close all at once, like background music to their walk, as they passed familiar landmarks, shops that were closing for the night, homes with lights shining through their windows. There was a sense of continuity, of life moving along as it always had, but it no longer felt like something that moved outside of him. It felt like something he was a part of, something he belonged to, and it was that understanding that allowed him to be present in the moment without feeling the need to rush toward anything else. "I've been thinking about the stone," his sister said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, thoughtful, and though the words seemed casual, there was an underlying depth to them. He glanced at her, but her gaze was focused ahead, her expression calm as she walked beside him. "The stone?" "The one in the clearing," she continued, her step steady. "It's strange, isn't it? How we keep going back to it. Like it's always been there, like it's always been waiting for us. But it isn't the stone itself, is it? It's what it represents, the stillness, the pause, the waiting." The boy nodded slowly, letting her words settle into him. He had never quite thought of it that way, but she was right. The stone wasn't something to be figured out or solved. It was a marker of something deeper, a stillness, a quiet space where time didn't move as fast, where answers weren't needed, where being was enough. He had learned that over time. The journey wasn't about finding something concrete, something to hold in his hands. It was about accepting the quiet unfolding of life. "I don't know what it is," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But I think I've come to realize that the answers aren't something we can chase. They just happen when we stop trying to look for them." His sister glanced at him, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She didn't say anything, but there was a spark in her eyes that let him know she understood. She had always been the one who asked the questions, who sought the answers. But now, as they walked together, he felt as though she too had begun to understand the quiet, peaceful rhythm of simply being, of allowing life to unfold without the need for force. They continued walking through the town, the night growing deeper, but there was no rush to be anywhere else. The world, with all its complexities and mysteries, felt simpler now, quieter, in a way that brought peace rather than uncertainty. The moon had risen high, casting silver light across the cobbled streets, and in that light, everything felt softer, more at ease. When they reached the edge of town, where the path began to wind toward the woods, the boy paused, his gaze lifting to the horizon. The forest beyond stretched out before him, familiar and inviting, yet there was no overwhelming pull to walk into it. The boy realized with a soft clarity that he didn't need to seek the answers any longer. The path was always there, always ready to guide him forward. But it wasn't about where it led, it was about how he walked it. His sister stopped beside him, and they stood there for a while, in the quiet of the night, simply breathing in the air, letting the world move around them at its own pace. There was no need to speak, no need to explain. They were here, in this moment, and that was enough. As they turned and made their way back toward the town, the boy felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Life was no longer something to be figured out. It was something to be lived, to be experienced, with presence, with understanding that everything unfolded in its own time. And with that understanding, there was nothing left to chase. They walked forward together, the path stretching ahead of them, not because they needed to know what lay ahead, but because they were content to walk it, step by step, with nothing but the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The rhythm of life seemed to fall into place in ways that had once felt elusive. The boy moved through the days with an ease that surprised him, as if the world around him had somehow opened up in a new way, inviting him to be fully present in the moments he once rushed past. The town, the woods, the familiar paths he had walked countless times, they no longer felt distant or separate from him. Instead, they were as much a part of his being as his own breath. He had become a part of them, woven into the fabric of the world around him. His sister's presence in his life had brought something new, something soft and steady, a quiet companionship that had helped him see the world in a way he hadn't before. They walked together side by side, each step carrying them forward without the need for words. There was no hurry, no destination to reach. They moved through the world, allowing it to unfold as it always had, with no need to force anything. One morning, the boy found himself standing in the town square, watching the people as they went about their day. The streets were busy, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and the soft hum of life. But as he stood there, he felt no desire to join in, no urgency to fill the space with his own presence. He simply watched, observing the ebb and flow of the world around him. There was a quiet beauty in it, a rhythm that didn't need to be rushed or interrupted. His sister was with him, standing silently by his side. She, too, seemed content in the stillness, her gaze distant, as if lost in her own thoughts. They didn't need to speak. It was enough to be here together in this moment. It was enough to simply exist in the quiet of the day, to allow the world to move around them without feeling the need to chase after it. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the world in warm, golden light, the boy felt a shift in the air. It wasn't a dramatic change, not something that demanded his attention. But it was there, a subtle pull, like a quiet invitation to take another step forward. He didn't know what that step would look like, nor did it matter. He simply knew that it was time to move again. Without saying anything, he turned and began walking toward the edge of town, his sister following quietly behind him. The path that led into the woods stretched out before them, familiar and welcoming. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, as if waiting for them to enter. There was no sense of urgency, no need to hurry. They walked at their own pace, side by side, allowing the world to breathe around them. The deeper they went into the woods, the more the world seemed to fall away, as though the trees themselves were wrapping them in a quiet embrace, shutting out the noise and busyness of the town behind them. The air grew cooler, the sounds of the forest growing louder as the world settled into the rhythm of evening. It was a peace that was both old and new, a quiet stillness that carried with it a sense of belonging, as though this was where they were always meant to be. They reached the clearing, the place where the stone had once stood as a marker, a symbol of the search for something. But now the stone seemed less significant. It was just part of the landscape, another element in the quiet unfolding of the world around them. The boy stood there for a moment looking at the stone, but there was no sense of longing or searching in his heart. He no longer needed the stone to answer anything. He understood now that the answers were not in things or symbols. They were in the quiet, in the moments of stillness when the world was allowed to unfold on its own terms. His sister stepped up beside him, and they stood together in silence, the cool evening air wrapping around them. They didn't speak, but there was a deep understanding between them, a shared recognition of the journey they had both been on, of the path they had walked together. There was no need for more words. The silence said everything that needed to be said. As the last light of the day faded, the boy felt a sense of completion, not in the sense of an ending, but in the understanding that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. He didn't need to look ahead, didn't need to plan or worry about what was coming. The journey was enough, and he was already walking it, step by step, with nothing to prove, nothing to find. With a final glance at the clearing, the stone, the trees, at everything that had shaped his path, the boy turned and began walking back. There was no sense of rushing, no need to hurry. They walked together, side by side, into whatever came next. And in that quiet certainty, they knew that the journey would continue. Not because they were searching for something, but because they were already part of it. Each step, each moment was enough. The days that followed were wrapped in a quiet sense of understanding, a deep, unspoken knowing that had settled between the boy and his sister. The town, the woods, the rhythms of their lives, they were no longer something to be navigated, something to be figured out. They simply were. And in that simple being, the boy felt a peace that had eluded him for so long, a peace that came from not seeking but from just living. They continued their walks together, moving through the town and the forest, with a calmness that felt like a natural extension of the world around them. The weight of questions had been lifted, not through answers, but through the quiet acceptance of the present moment. Every step, every breath was enough. One morning, as the sun rose softly over the horizon, casting long, golden rays through the trees, the boy found himself walking alone for the first time in days. His sister had stayed behind, still nestled in the quiet comfort of their shared home, but the boy had felt the gentle tug of the woods once more. There was nothing specific calling him there, no pressing reason to go, but a soft invitation to return to that familiar, sacred place. The path through the woods was unchanged, and as he walked, he realized that he no longer felt the need to move with a destination in mind. He simply walked. The trees, the wind, the soft rustling of leaves beneath his feet, all of it was part of a larger living rhythm, a rhythm he no longer felt separate from. When he arrived at the clearing, he stood there for a moment, taking it in. The stone, weathered and worn, was still there, but now it felt like just another part of the landscape. It wasn't a symbol to be understood, nor a marker to be reached. It was simply a stone, as it always had been, and in that simplicity it had become something profoundly quiet and meaningful. The boy sat on the ground, his legs crossed, and placed his hands on the earth beneath him. The familiar hum of life surrounded him, the song of birds in the trees, the gentle breeze stirring the leaves, the distant rustling of creatures moving through the underbrush. There was no need for words, no need for action. He simply let himself be present, letting the world move around him without resistance. Time passed, though the boy didn't feel it. It was as though the world, in its quiet, gentle unfolding, had removed the need for him to measure time in hours or days. He wasn't waiting for something to change. He wasn't trying to force the world to reveal its secrets. He was simply a part of it, moving through it as naturally as the wind through the trees. Eventually the sun began to dip lower in the sky, and the shadows in the clearing lengthened. He didn't feel a pull to return home. There was no urgency, no need to rush back to anything. He stayed a little longer, just breathing in the stillness, just being with the world. There was no destination, there was no end, there was only the quiet unfolding of each moment. And that was enough. When he finally stood and began walking back toward the town, the path was familiar, but it no longer felt like a road leading somewhere. It was simply a part of the world, moving through the same rhythm as everything else. The boy didn't feel lost, nor did he feel the need to find anything. He simply walked, step by step, feeling the pulse of life beneath his feet, and he knew, in that quiet certainty, that the journey would continue. Not because he was searching for something, but because he was already part of it. Every step was enough. The town came into view once more, the familiar houses and streets bathed in the soft light of dusk. The boy didn't feel the need to hurry. He had learned over the course of his journey that there was no rush. The world would reveal itself when the time was right, and until then he would continue walking one step at a time through whatever came next. And with that thought, the boy realized that he had already arrived. The journey, with all its questions and answers, its quiet pauses and gentle unfolding, had brought him exactly where he needed to be. He had learned finally that there was no destination, only the journey itself. And in that journey, he had already found everything he needed.